It started as just another fun dance segment on The Tonight Show, until a 72-year-old woman stood up and asked for something that would break everyone's heart. The Tonight Show studio was alive with music and movement as Jimmy Fallon wrapped up another viral-worthy dance segment. With his celebrity guest, the audience was on their feet, clapping along to the Roots' infectious rhythm. And Jimmy was feeling that familiar high that came from a segment where everything clicked perfectly. These dance moments had become one of his signature bits. Spontaneous, joyful, and guaranteed to put smiles on faces across America. As the music wound down and Jimmy caught his breath, he did what he always did after a successful dance segment. He turned to the audience with his arms spread wide, riding the wave of their enthusiasm. "Come on, everybody," Jimmy called out over the cheering crowd. "I know some of you were dancing in your seats. Don't be shy." The audience laughed and applauded, many of them indeed having been moving along with the music from their seats. Jimmy loved these moments of connection with the live audience, the spontaneous energy that made each taping unique and special. That's when he noticed her. In the fourth row center section, an elderly woman was slowly rising from her seat. She was perhaps 72 years old, with silver hair elegantly styled and wearing a navy blue dress that suggested this was a special occasion for her. But what caught Jimmy's attention wasn't her age or her attire. It was the expression on her face. While everyone around her was laughing and cheering, she wore a look of profound longing, mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "Oh, we have someone who wants to dance," Jimmy said with his trademark enthusiasm, gesturing toward the woman. "What's your name, ma'am?" The woman clutched her small purse tightly to her chest and spoke in a voice that was surprisingly strong, despite the tremor of emotion Jimmy could detect beneath it. "Margaret," she said, her voice carrying across the studio despite its softness. "Margaret Thompson." "Margaret Thompson," Jimmy repeated warmly. "Where are you from, Margaret?" "Here in New York," Margaret replied, still standing while the audience around her had begun to quiet, sensing that something different was happening. Queens, actually? Born and raised? Jimmy smiled that genuine smile that had endeared him to millions of viewers over the years. "A local. I love it. So, Margaret, did you want to show us some moves? I saw you getting into the music there." Margaret's eyes filled with tears so suddenly that it caught Jimmy off guard. The studio audience, picking up on the shift in the atmosphere, grew quieter still. "Mr. Fallon," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly, "I haven't danced in 8 months." The words hung in the air, and Jimmy's entertainer instincts immediately told him that this was one of those moments that could go in any direction. He walked closer to Margaret's section, his expression shifting from performer to human being. 8 months is a long time," Jimmy said gently. "Any particular reason why?" Margaret wiped her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her purse, clearly struggling with whether to share what was obviously a painful story with a studio full of strangers. "My husband, Harold," she began, her voice growing stronger even as tears continued to flow. "We danced together for 50 years, every Friday night without fail. Sometimes in our living room, sometimes at the community center, sometimes just in the kitchen while dinner was cooking." The studio was completely quiet now, 300 people holding their collective breath as they witnessed this elderly woman sharing her heart on live television. "Harold passed away last year," Margaret continued, and several audience members audibly gasped. "COVID. We were so careful, but somehow—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Jimmy's eyes immediately filled with tears. He'd lost his own mother, and the word COVID still hit him like a physical blow, knowing how many families had been shattered by the pandemic. "Margaret, I'm so sorry," Jimmy said sincerely, his voice thick with emotion. "Harold sounds like he was a wonderful man." "He was the love of my life," Margaret said simply, and the pure truth of those words resonated through the studio like a bell. 54 years of marriage. We met at a USO dance when we were both 19. He was the most terrible dancer I'd ever seen. Despite her tears, Margaret smiled at the memory, and Jimmy found himself smiling too. But he kept asking me to dance anyway? Jimmy asked. Every single song, Margaret laughed, wiping her eyes. And somehow, over the years, we figured it out together. We weren't Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, but we were Harold and Margaret, and we could make magic happen on any dance floor. Jimmy had moved closer now, standing at the edge of the audience section, his full attention focused on this remarkable woman who was sharing her love story with perfect strangers. So what brings you here tonight, Margaret? To the Tonight Show? Margaret looked around the studio, taking in the cameras, the lights, the sea of faces, all focused on her with expressions of compassion and interest. My daughter bought me this ticket 6 months ago, Margaret explained. She said I needed to get out of the house, that Harold wouldn't want me hiding away forever, but I've been putting it off, making excuses. Tonight was the expiration date. It was come tonight or lose the chance forever. And how do you feel about being here? Jimmy asked. Scared? Margaret admitted with surprising honesty. This is the first time I've been anywhere that Harold and I used to go together. We watched your show every night, right up until the end. Harold would always say you reminded him of his grandson, full of energy and always trying to make people smile. Jimmy was crying openly now, but he was also smiling. Harold sounds like he had great taste. He did, Margaret agreed, and he loved to dance. Even when he got sick, even when he could barely walk to the bathroom, he would still hold my hand, and we would sway together during the slow songs on your show. The audience was completely silent, except for the soft sounds of people wiping their eyes and trying to control their emotions. Margaret, Jimmy said softly, you said you haven't danced in 8 months? Is that because it's too painful without Harold? Margaret nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. Every time I hear music, every time I see couples dancing, all I can think about is how empty my arms feel, how quiet the house is, without his terrible singing, how there's nobody to step on my toes anymore. Jimmy looked around the studio, at the Roots, at his crew, at the audience members who were all leaning forward in their seats, completely invested in Margaret's story. Margaret, Jimmy said, and something in his tone made everyone in the studio pay even closer attention. Would you like to dance tonight? Here, with all of us? Margaret's eyes went wide. Oh, Mr. Fallon, I couldn't. I'm 72 years old, and I haven't moved to music since Harold, Jimmy finished gently. I understand. But what if I told you that Harold is here with us tonight? Margaret looked around the studio, confused. What do you mean? Jimmy stepped fully into the audience section and walked down the aisle to where Margaret was sitting. He extended his hand to her. I mean, that love like yours doesn't just disappear when someone dies, Jimmy said, his voice clear and strong enough for everyone to hear. I mean that 50 years of Friday night dances live inside you forever. I mean that Harold taught you how to move to music, and that gift is still yours. Margaret stared at Jimmy's outstretched hand, clearly torn between wanting to accept and being afraid of what that acceptance might mean. But I'll cry, Margaret whispered. I'll probably fall apart completely. Then we'll cry together, Jimmy replied simply. And if you fall apart, we'll help put you back together, because that's what people do for each other. That's what Harold would want us to do. The studio was so quiet that you could hear the air conditioning humming. 300 people watched as a 72-year-old widow faced one of the hardest decisions of her life. Finally, slowly, Margaret reached out and took Jimmy's hand. The applause that erupted was unlike anything The Tonight Show had ever heard. It wasn't the polite applause of a television audience or the excited cheering of fans. It was the sound of 300 people recognizing courage when they saw it. celebrating a woman who was choosing love over fear. Jimmy helped Margaret to her feet and gently guided her toward the stage area, where there was more room to move. As they walked, he spoke to her quietly. "What was Harold's favorite song to dance to?" Jimmy asked. Margaret thought for a moment. "We had so many over the years, but recently, in his final months, he always asked for 'The Way You Look Tonight.' He said it reminded him of our wedding day." Jimmy turned to the Roots, who had been watching this entire exchange with tears in their eyes. "Questlove, do you guys know 'The Way You Look Tonight'?" "We know it," Questlove replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Should we play it soft and slow?" "Perfect," Jimmy said. As the gentle opening notes of the classic song began to fill the studio, Jimmy turned to Margaret. She was standing in the middle of the stage, looking small and vulnerable under the bright lights. "I don't know if I remember how," Margaret said, suddenly looking panicked. "Your body remembers," Jimmy assured her. "Harold made sure of that. 50 years of practice doesn't just disappear." Jimmy placed one hand gently on Margaret's waist and took her other hand in his, just as Harold had done thousands of times before. Margaret closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. And then, slowly, beautifully, they began to dance. At first, Margaret was stiff, clearly fighting against muscle memory and emotion. But as the Roots continued to play and Jimmy led her gently around the stage, something magical began to happen. Her posture softened. Her movements became more fluid. Her face, which had been tight with grief and fear, began to relax. "That's it," Jimmy whispered, as they swayed together. "Harold's right here with us. Can you feel him?" Margaret's eyes were closed, but tears were streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition, of remembrance, of joy rediscovered. "I can feel him," Margaret whispered back. "He's laughing because you're a much better dancer than he ever was." Jimmy laughed softly. "I doubt that. I bet Harold could have taught me a thing or two." As they continued to dance, something extraordinary happened in the studio. The audience members began to sway in their seats, some of them thinking of their own lost loves, their own memories of dancing with people who were no longer with them. The camera operators found themselves moving to the rhythm as they captured this intimate moment. Even the production crew in the control room had stopped working and were simply watching this 72-year-old woman rediscover a part of herself she thought she had lost forever. "You know what Harold would say if he could see you right now?" Jimmy asked as they turned slowly under the stage lights. "What?" Margaret asked, opening her eyes to look at Jimmy. "He'd say, 'There's my girl, there's my dancing queen. I knew you still had it in you.'" Margaret broke down completely then, sobbing against Jimmy's shoulder while they continued to move to the music. But they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release, of healing, of a woman allowing herself to feel joy again for the first time in 8 months. The song continued for what felt like both an eternity and not nearly long enough. When the Roots finally brought it to a gentle close, Jimmy and Margaret stood in the center of the stage, still holding each other, both crying and both smiling. The applause that followed lasted for nearly 10 minutes. The audience was on their feet, many of them crying themselves, all of them recognizing that they had just witnessed something profound. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was healing, happening in real time in front of cameras and lights and 300 strangers who had become family. Jimmy held Margaret's hands and looked into her eyes. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been holding my breath for 8 months and finally remembered how to breathe," Margaret replied, her voice strong and clear despite her tears. Jimmy turned to address the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we just witnessed wasn't just a dance. It was a reminder that love doesn't end when someone dies. It lives on in the way we move, in the way we remember, in the way we choose to honor the people who made our lives beautiful." He looked back at Margaret. "Harold may not be here in body, but his love for you is, and that love is going to keep you dancing for the rest of your life." Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes with the tissue Jimmy handed her. "He always said I was too stubborn to quit anything, including dancing." "Sounds like Harold knew you pretty well," Jimmy said with a grin. "Better than I knew myself sometimes," Margaret replied. Jimmy walked Margaret back to her seat, but before she sat down, he had one more surprise for her. "Margaret, I want you to know that you're welcome back here anytime. And if you ever want to dance again, you just let us know. Because tonight you reminded all of us that it's never too late to find joy again, and it's never wrong to let love lead you back to the things that make you feel alive." Margaret hugged Jimmy tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." "I think I do," Jimmy replied, "because you just reminded me what this job is really about. It's not about being funny or getting laughs or going viral. It's about creating moments where people remember what matters most." As Margaret returned to her seat, the audience continued to applaud. But more than that, something had shifted in the studio. People were talking to each other, sharing their own stories of loss and love and memories of dancing with people they missed. The Tonight Show had become something more than a television taping. It had become a community gathering, a place where grief could be transformed into gratitude. 3 weeks later, Jimmy received a letter from Margaret. In it, she told him that she had started going to the community center again, the same one where she and Harold had danced for decades. She had joined a dance group for widows and widowers, and she was helping other people rediscover the joy of movement and music. "You were right," Margaret wrote. "Harold is still with me every time I dance, and now I'm helping other people find their way back to the dance floor too. Thank you for reminding me that love doesn't end. It just changes form." Jimmy kept Margaret's letter in his dressing room, right next to a photo from that night. Margaret, in the middle of the stage, eyes closed, arms outstretched, looking for all the world like a woman who had just remembered she knew how to fly. 6 months later, Margaret returned to The Tonight Show as a special guest. This time, she brought her new dance partner, a 78-year-old widower named Frank, whom she had met at the community center. They performed a beautiful waltz on the same stage where Margaret had rediscovered her love of dancing. And when they finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. "You see," Jimmy said to the camera as the show ended that night, "sometimes the most important dances aren't the ones that make you famous or get you noticed. Sometimes the most important dances are the ones that remind you that you're still alive, that you're still capable of joy, that love really is stronger than loss." The camera lingered on Margaret and Frank as they took their bow, two people who had found each other through grief and discovered that sometimes the best partnerships come after you think your dancing days are over. "Margaret Thompson, everybody," Jimmy said, his voice thick with emotion. "Proof that it's never too late to answer when love asks you to dance." Because that's what Margaret had learned that night on the Tonight Show stage, that Harold hadn't taken their dancing with him when he died. He had left it with her, along with 50 years of Friday nights and kitchen slow dances, and the unshakable knowledge that some kinds of love are too strong to be stopped by something as small as death. And now she was dancing again, not just for herself, but for Harold and for Frank, and for all the people who needed to be reminded that the music never really stops. It just waits for us to remember that we still know the steps.